Thank you so much for being here today with us, and thank you for supporting the EMH. I also want to recognize the members of our 3 thematic committee whose regular contribution advance our discussion on open source and energy modeling. So we have 44 dedicated volunteers, again from across Canada. Please follow our work via our website if you want to be involved. We are always looking for people to support those committees, so let me know. And if you want to know more about this, you can subscribe as well to your newsletter. So now it's my enormous pleasure to introduce Jason Dion. He's the Senior Research Director at the Canadian Climate Institute, where he leads mitigation and research team, Indigenous research teams, and the 440 Megaton projects. He was a principal author of the Institute 2021 report, The Big Switch, aligning Canada electricity system with net zero. Jason is also a representative and member of Canada Electricity Advisory Council, chairing the Planning and Utility Regulation Working Group. He's here to share some insight to kick off our second day and lead us into the discussion on clean electricity regulation. So please join me in welcoming Jason to the stage.
Morning, everyone. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the Electricity Advisory Council and what we've been up to since we got our start a few months ago. So let me just figure this out. Here we go. So what is the Electricity Advisory Council? So it's 18 experts on electricity systems from all across Canada, with backgrounds from utilities, regulators, system operators, as well as some folks from civil society like myself. Philippe Dunsky, the president of Dunsky Energy Advisors, is the chair of the Advisory Council. And the mandate that the council has is to provide independent advice to the Minister of Natural Resources on how, and the terms I'd put it in, are how we can make electricity systems bigger, cleaner, and smarter in order to meet our climate goals. So that includes not only making generation non-emitting, but enabling the widespread electrification that we're going to need to support our climate goals, and all while doing that, while we make electricity continue to be affordable and reliable. So big task, big challenge. So the council has a 1-year mandate with a final report due in the spring, and we're going to be releasing an interim report in the coming weeks, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So what are the specific focuses of the council? So we've organized ourselves around 5 working groups, around 5 key themes. So there's a first around planning and utility regulation in the context of net zero, which I'm chairing given some of the Institute's past work on this and the big switch. We have a second working group on projects and infrastructure. How do we get stuff built faster and in a way that can create benefits for Indigenous communities? A third around capital attraction and affordability in the energy transition. I'm also serving on this working group, given some related work at the Institute, which I'll touch on in a moment. Fourth, that perennial question of how do we ensure that we're making the whole greater than the sum of its parts, that Canada's kind of siloed approach to electricity systems across provinces, that we realize those benefits and that potential of better integration and coordination. And fifth and finally, how do we enable and unleash technological innovations in electricity systems while maintaining grid reliability and resiliency? So, easy scope of work for us. I'll touch briefly here on what you can expect in our interim report that'll be coming out in the next few weeks. So in this interim report, we're highlighting some areas of early emerging consensus within the council, as well as weighing in on a few policy areas where there's a live discussion going on. So I'll just signal here today that that's going to include a recommendation on the clean electricity regulations, not necessarily a deep dive. I think the council will be providing some directional advice there. The Institute is taking a deeper dive into some of the design variables in the CER, and in the next session you'll see Evan Pivnik from Clean Energy Canada, who's somewhere here in the corner. We're partnered with Clean Energy Canada on our submission and response and modeling of the CER, so you'll hear more about that. But the Institute's going to, or excuse me, the Council is going to stay a little higher level in its review of that topic. We're also going to be weighing in on the clean electricity investment tax credits that were proposed in the federal budget on 2 fronts. One, what should the conditions of provincial receipt of those investment tax credits be? So the budget signaled that there would be some conditions attached to it. Second, what should the scope of those credits be, given what they apply to, which technologies? Also going to weigh in on the Indigenous loan guarantees that were proposed in the fall economic statement, and a fifth topic of how we can ensure that supply chains and labor markets are ready for this transition. So that's only a subset of the topics that the larger final report of the council will weigh in on. And within this big scope that you're seeing here, I think the focus is going to be, what are the key areas of policy interventions that governments, and in particular the federal government, can make that would enable a cost-effective electricity sector transition while respecting provincial jurisdiction over electricity. So on top of that interim report launching soon, we're also launching right about now some consultation and engagement. So the Council has put together a discussion guide that asks a number of key questions that we're seeking input on. So we're asking for written feedback by late January, so a bit of a tight window. But if any of your groups have provided submissions in the past to NRCan or ECCC on these topics, you can expect that we've seen that work. So no need to duplicate past submissions. For example, the NRCan had a request for information on net zero mandates earlier this year, so you can assume we've seen that. But really interested to hear from this group and all sorts of stakeholders what their views are on some of these questions we're posing in this discussion guide. So I'm going to talk about the questions that we've posed for the working group I'm chairing, because I think this audience is uniquely able to answer some of the questions we've set out there. So we've recognized in that working group that current utility regulator system operator mandates need a clarification and update in the context of net zero. Now, that's not the same as a fundamental reimagining, but those existing mandates that you see across the country, which more or less amount to providing safe and reliable power at just and reasonable rates, that those need a bit of clarification in the context of the net zero transition. So we have some thinking and ideas on what that can look like in practice. But it's also not enough. To mandate these bodies to pursue net zero is a very open-ended goal. So you need to give them the resources and the guidelines and the tools to actually fulfill that mandate. So interested to hear what this group would think of what that should include. How do you operationalize a net zero mandate? But also interested to hear your views on two of the tools that we think are fundamental to this. So a first is independent pathway assessments, and that's what you see in the second question there. That these pathway assessments, which would take a whole economy perspective of what are a jurisdiction's options in terms of reaching that net zero goal, what are the pros and cons of different pathways, that these be top-down, kind of very large economy-wide modeling exercises, but that they really focus on practical questions and options in terms of how a jurisdiction can get there. Critical to us that these be independent, that they provide an objective look at some of these questions, excuse me, and periodically updated to reflect new technological options and changing cost profiles. But the question we're posing for people is, what are the best practices and key features of these kinds of pathway assessments? So what scenarios should they consider? What sources of uncertainty should they unpack? What should the features and characteristics of the underlying models be, their assumptions? So this crowd is kind of uniquely able to answer some of those questions. And you could really think of this as an opportunity to sort of put together a best practices document of what does a good pathway assessment look like? What questions does it answer? And this can hopefully be the basis in time, not only of how jurisdictions commission these pathway assessments, but the template that they're compared against and making sure that they answer the right questions and can be a useful touchstone to utilities, to regulators in their decision making, and to governments in policy making. So what does a good independent pathway assessment look like is a key question. A second is about net zero energy roadmaps. So these are documents developed by governments to provide guidance to regulators and other actors on how that government envisions the energy transition unfolding. So they provide some signposts, some milestones, without being overly prescriptive in terms of exactly what they would like to see, leaving that to the expert bodies to determine. But these guidance documents are more than sort of motherhood vision documents. If we think about Powering Ontario's growth plan this summer, you had some real serious concrete guidance being provided to the IESO, to other bodies, on how to go about this transition, giving them some of the vision as well as some of the milestones they need to go about that task. So same question there. What are the best practices and features of energy roadmaps that can enable a cost-effective energy transition? So for the next part of this, I'm going to do my two remaining slides in backwards order. So I'm going to jump ahead. Here we go. So I also wanted to touch on the work of the Money and Affordability Working Group that I'm part of. So this working group really wants to take the baton in terms of some of the work the Climate Institute has done to look at rates and affordability in the energy transition. So on this slide, you're seeing some of the Institute's findings from our June report, Clean Electricity, Affordable Energy. That report itself was an update of some of the work we did in Big Switch. So in that work, we were one of the first, or I think the first, to take a lot of the results of these big modeling studies of what does it mean to align electricity systems with net zero, and pull out a lot of their findings on what it means for investment costs and pair that with our knowledge of, well, given utilities' current debt loads, given how rate basing is done, how amortization is done, what does all that mean for electricity rates? What can we expect to happen in the energy transition? So we took an attempt at that, and you can see it on the panel at the left. It was a first attempt. It drawed on studies that were either proxying the effects and impacts of the clean electricity regulations, which weren't even concretely proposed at that time, or it didn't include them at all. So we knew it was a rough indication of sort of the trajectory we can expect for rates. And we want this to be part of an evolution where we're seeing greater and greater resolution from the modeling community on what this means. And the council really wants to take this on in its own work. So the Climate Institute is going to be working with the council, and I'll be on the steering committee for this work, to produce a new version of this that draws on the most recent modeling studies, many of which do include the impacts of the clean electricity regulations. And so we're currently finalizing who will be working with us on this. It might be Transition Accelerator, so Mo's here from the Transition Accelerator. Really going to be working with them to answer this question of rates, but also affordability in the larger energy transition. So on that right side of the slide, you're seeing our findings from our own net zero modeling on, well, given the prospects for electricity rates, given changing usage patterns, so we're using more electricity at slightly higher rates, what does that mean for energy wallets? And that, because we're using more electricity, we're paying more for it, but we're also spending less on gasoline and other fossil fuels. So what does all that mean when it shakes out? And the big version of the question that we've tried to take on is not just what does it mean for utility bills, right, which we've seen others weigh in on, the International Energy Agency, but what does it also mean inclusive of capital costs? So we might be spending less on energy overall, but when you account for, we're buying electric vehicles instead of internal combustion engines, heat pumps instead of furnaces, when you include that, what are the real prospects for affordability? Because that's the scope that matters for households, the kind of all-in energy wallet. So we had a clear finding from our own work that on average, Canadians can expect to be spending less on the other side of the energy transition. But in a way, this is one data point. So this came from our net zero work. We did a pretty comprehensive literature review looking at what others have found when it came to this question. And again, we found that question of what does it mean for utility bills usually had a pretty clear answer, but this all-in scope of what does it mean inclusive of capital costs, the question hadn't quite been answered that way or asked that way in some circumstances, or at least there hadn't been a clear answer. So we have one answer to this. The council really wants to take a deeper dive, leverage a bunch of other modeling studies to get the best possible answer to this question. So we're investing in this at the council. And now I can go back to my previous slide, and there's a request here to this group, and that's for your support in going about this exercise. We have a limited amount of time to do it. It's a big job, and it's kind of a four-part series of questions. The first is maybe the easiest. When we look at all of these high-quality modeling studies of this energy transition, what does it mean for the investment that's required in electricity systems? So nationally and by province. That's pretty straightforward. We can pull that out of some of these modeling studies. That next step, what does it mean for electricity rates? So working with utilities' debt loads, working with best practices in rate basing and in amortization to sort of understand how that's going to translate into rates. So that's a second question, not an easy one either. The third is energy wallet. When we look at these modeling studies, how can we pull out findings around what households can expect to be spending on energy in the course of the energy transition? And fourth and finally, not a small question, what are the distributional implications of that? Because what might be true on average isn't necessarily going to be true for different regions, different parts of the income distribution. So this is a big job. And having been through it a bit myself with our work at the Institute, I know how tough it is. It requires working really closely with some of the modeling groups, many of whom are represented in this room. So the Advisory Council and Transition Accelerator, we believe, are going to be engaged in this quite closely starting now and would really appreciate the support and input of many of the groups that did this work, as well as anybody else that might be willing to lend a hand to this broader effort. This is a set of questions that comes up again and again and again in the energy transition. And full disclosure, I almost find some of them annoying on a certain level. It's because the question can amount to, is the transition so cost effective it pays for itself? Like, if climate change weren't real, should we do this anyway? It's a frustrating question almost, but it's understandable. People want to know what the impacts are. What can I expect? What does it mean for me and my family? And having a clear answer to these set of questions and one that can be backed by the sort of profile and weight of some of the people involved in the council, I think makes it a really worthy exercise. So a bit of a personal plea to this group to please give Mo and others a hand in this exercise, given the tight timelines. I think it's a really important part of the work that the council is doing. So I'll have to leave it at that in terms of my review of what the council is up to, but if you'd like to learn more, feel free to pull me aside in one part of the day. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for such a compelling introduction. That set the table. So we're now ready to embark on session 6. Federal fiscal measures announced in budget 2023, along with the proposed clean electricity regulation, are seen as one of the most significant federal intervention in the economic sector for decades. It's with great anticipation that we introduce this session today, where for the first time, we've brought 6 modeling teams together on stage. This is why there are 7 chairs, so one team has 2 representatives. They will share insights and results on the transformative effect of the clean electricity regulation. So to moderate this complex session, we're delighted to have Mo Cabrera, Vice President at the Transition Accelerator. Mo is a seasoned energy and climate professional with nearly a decade of experience at convergence of technology, policy, and markets. His expertise spans transportations, electrification, renewable energy, energy storage, and energy efficiency. So Mo and the 6 teams have been working together over the past few weeks, even early this morning, to finish these panels. And we're proud to introduce them to you today. But as it was mentioned yesterday, please be kind in your comment and result and questions. We're going to use Mentimeter like yesterday. So normally the same Mentimeter works. So if you go back to menti.com, you use 13873384. I'm going to send this back in the chat later. If you want to ask questions during the panel, that's fine with you. It's going to be a little bit different. So we have 6 presentations. So 10-minute presentation, 10-minute Q&A, 10-minute presentation, 10-minute Q&A. So 1 Q&A session with each groups. And so it's going to span across 2 hours. So it's going to be long, but super interesting. So please, without further ado, help me welcoming Mo Cabrera to the stage.
Morning, everyone. So yeah, I mean, this is buckle in, 2 hours, 15 minutes. So we have 6 presenters here today, and we're really excited to kind of share the insights that they've prepared. So I'll start off really by just giving a quick introduction to what we're talking about. So the clean electricity regulations impacts. So I'll kind of present that quickly, present a little bit of a summary of the 6 methodologies that are going to be presented, and then we'll start to go through the presentations. As mentioned, the format, I think, to kind of keep it more lively and interactive, we'll pause a little bit between the presenters. So we'll have 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. So use the Mentimeter. If you just want to have a quick question in, I'll be kind of leveraging those as part of the Q&A and discussion that I'll have with each presenter. So to start off here, wanted to kind of just look at the high level of the clean electricity regulations and, think through in terms of like why was that developed? What's the rationale behind it? So we know that, net zero electricity and electricity more broadly is going to be one of the most essential components of a net zero economy by 2050. And we also know that there are a lot of things driving that, including the net zero goals, but also other things, industrial strategies. Like if you look at the battery investments that we've been able to attract over the last couple of years from cathode manufacturing and cell manufacturing, the amount that clean electricity played a role in attracting that, including things also, as Jason mentioned, our increased reliance on electrification at the end use side, somewhat, I would say driven by our ambitions to a net zero society. But in the case of EVs, for example, we also see a lot of benefits, both from the consumer performance preferences, but also economic, and also obviously population growth. So we'll look at you can look at different models, but the idea is that, there's going to be quite a significant increase to the electricity demand that we have today. So, there are key steps that are going to be necessary to achieve that net zero electricity. So we need to clean up the existing electricity supply that we have. We need to use energy efficiency where possible, but we also need to grow the system quite significantly. So right now we're about 20% of the energy mix is provided by electricity, and that's expected to kind of grow significantly over over the next 30 years. So looking at the CER at a glance as a regulatory signal, really the regulations are aimed to establish near zero emissions. So it's not net zero or zero emissions, I would say. That's something that we need to kind of clarify, and I'll speak a bit about that in the next slide. But the idea here is that there's enough flexibilities, but they don't really eliminate emissions. That's not what they're doing. But also they're technology neutral. The aim is to allow for that, I would say the balancing of the three variables that we care about, which are reliability, affordability, and clean. And, there's various perspectives in terms of the provisions that are already there, how we can tweak those to be able to achieve that balance. And we'll hear from some of the panelists today, some of the modeling that they've done above the draft regulations that have been put in place, and testing out a little bit of tweaks for those specific provisions and clauses. So what's in scope? To kind of summarize at a very high level, we don't have a lot of time here. I was given the great challenge of summarizing the CER and 6 methodologies in 5 minutes. So to basically try to put some boundary conditions around this. Really, the idea here is that, this regulation applies at the unit level, right? So we're looking at a unit generating electricity that uses fossil fuels for electricity, and the idea is that any unit that has a capacity of 25 megawatts or more, and connected to the electricity system, will be included in this regulation. The idea is that there's a performance standard of 30 tons per gigawatt hour emissions annually. And the idea that this would be applicable to units that have been commissioned after January 1st, 2025. So this is where the timeline things matter quite a bit, because basically existing units that have been commissioned before 2025 will be allowed to run for 20 years after commissioning. So the idea, like if you have, let's say, a plant that was built in 2015, that means 2035, that plant the CER will be applicable to that plant. But if a plant was built in January 2024, then that will be allowed to go until 2044. So the idea here is that 2035 is not a hard point here for all the units. So there's basically flexibility there, and the prescribed life is one of the provisions that some have commented on in terms of increasing that flexibility. The ways to comply here really for the units that actually have to comply with the CER, so the applicable units, either actually meet the performance standards, so that's whether with carbon capture, with hydrogen or RNG, actually operate less than 450 hours, so that's the peaking provision, so allowing units, understanding that flexibility and reliability is extremely important for the grid, so there's actual peaking provision there. And again, that is one of the things that has been discussed as the number of hours as a way to kind of increase the balance between the reliability into the mix. Or you can shut down the plant. That's the sort of last option there. So I'll kind of leave it at that, just as I mentioned, there's a lot of details here, a lot of exemptions and nuances. But at the end of the day, I kind of just wanted to show the distinction between when we talk about net zero 2035, what do we actually mean by that? Is that all units? Is that going to be something that is a hard line? So that's something that we'll discuss a bit more with the modeling. So we have 6 modelers today. Really the idea here that most of these models are using sort of capacity expansion models and some dispatch models, and are looking at mostly provincial results as well. So there's a sort of Canada-wide. In some case, we have just a look at Atlantic Canada. And the idea here is that, these models are mostly looking at, all of them are looking out to 2050. Some of them have different starting points. And also when we're looking at basically some of the things they've modeled, we see sort of a range, but not a very large range in terms of what's the assumed carbon capture rate, for example, whether, there's going to be the full carbon tax starting 2035 for those plants that are allowed to continue. And then on the demand assumption here, we're seeing, as I mentioned before, there's going to be a lot of growth. We have a range between 1.7 on the higher to over two times growth. So there's also a range for demand assumptions. So with that, I'll introduce Mohammed from the Net Zero Atlantic to kind of start us off with the first presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank EMH for this wonderful event. And my name is Mohammed Al-Kathiri, and I'm the Energy System Modeler with Net Zero Atlantic. Today, I'm going to talk about the impact of the CR on the... Okay. So I'm going to talk about the impact of the CR on the Atlantic region. I will start my presentation by introducing my organization, and then we'll dive into our open source model, talking about its features and how we configure our ACES model to run this analysis, and then we'll dive into the result and the main takeaway from this result. So Net Zero Atlantic is a non-profit applied research organization that is based on Nova Scotia. And we have projects with the 4 Atlantic provinces. Our core team consists of engineers and scientists who lead applied research to transit Atlantic Canada towards a net carbon neutral future region. We have projects with the 4 Atlantic provinces, as I said, and we are not only working with the modeling. We have works related to hydrogen, to offshore wind, and all other clean technology. We have collaboration with different kind of organization, including corporation like IBM. You may want to see their work in the other hall, and they have presented their collaboration work with us yesterday. And we have work with the indigenous lead organization like Unamaki Institute Institute of Renewable Research, and also we have worked with the provincial and federal government. So this modeling project is a result of collaboration and engagement with different kind of organizations, but I would like to highlight the main funder and supporter for this project. So the main funder for this project was NRCan, and all other provincial and regional organizations come together to support this model. So ACES model is an open source model that is based on a capacity expansion, and it's highly configurable. It covers 6 sectors, including electricity, transportation, and all other sectors. It's for all 4 provinces. The planning horizon starts from 2022 to 2050. And it's open source, so it's enhanced the transparency and the collective understanding, and it have a continuous development. It's built on TIMOA, which is a very well-known open source model that is based on US. So here I'm going to explain how we configure our model to assist the clean electricity regulation. We have 2 kind of scenarios, the business as usual and the CER. So the things that I want to highlight here is that the things that in the blue, how we model the operational limit for the backup generators. So we use the annual maximum capacity factor and the emission limit mass, which is, we use the annual maximum capacity factor based on the nominal size. Another things that we distinguish between the 2 is how we model the carbon policy. Of course, the federal carbon tax have applied to the both, but how we model the output-based pricing system is different in both scenarios. So we say that in the business as usual, we have a binding OBS until 2050, while in the clean electricity regulation scenarios, we have said that past 2035, the carbon tax will be fully applied, so there will be no offset using the OBS. Of course, coal will be phased out in both scenarios. So I will not dive into the weeds of the details of the modeling configurations. The things that I want to highlight here is that the inter-regional transmissions. So what we did here is that, and it is a common practice for these kind of models, that to assume the inter-regional collaboration is perfect, which means that electricity trade within the Atlantic region is happening at free cost, and the expansion, there is an option to expand the transmission lines within the Atlantic regions at a cost, while the transmission between Atlantic region and all other regions next to it, there is no option to expand it, but there is a cost to transmit electricity between Atlantic region and all adjacent regions. Another thing is that there is no option to retrofit the fossil fuel generators with CCS, but there's an option to build out of the natural gas with CCS. So we have two scenarios, and we have 3 demand assumptions. So we come up with 6 scenarios. And now I'm going to explain how we modeled our demand. So we have low, mid, and high growth. And the logic behind that is that for the first one, there is a E3 report that has been published to assist the Atlantic Loop. We have taken their electrification assumption, which means that the new prescribed sales of, for example, light-duty electrical vehicle and heat pumps, we put that into our 3-sector ACES model on a demand-side mode. And from there, we get the load forecast over the planning horizon. Please note that this electrification rate that we get from the E3 is a high electrification. But when we compare it to the Canada Net Zero scenarios from the Canada Energy Future 2023, it tends to be low. Then the medium growth in that one, we looked into the demand forecast for the scenario of Canada Net Zero scenario. And in that one, the hydrogen demand for the domestic use have been incorporated. But the way we incorporated that is that we say that hydrogen would be supplied through a dedicated offshore and onshore wind. So 95% of that would be supplied by the dedicated offshore and onshore wind, and 5% will come from the grid. And of course, in the Atlantic region, we have so many discussion about the producing hydrogen for the exports. But in this study, I want to highlight that we only consider the hydrogen for the domestic use. The last demand assumption in that one, that hydrogen demand that we found for the domestic use in the Canada Net Zero scenario, we added that to the total electricity demand, and we get the high growth demand. The way you model hydrogen is actually uncertain. We don't know how, is that hydrogen should be supplied from the electricity grid, or should be supplied from the dedicated offshore and onshore or renewable resources. So this is the demand assumption that we modeled as a graph, as you can see here. And here's the results, the emission and the cost results. As you can see in the bar chart here in the top right, we found that there is no significant change between business as usual and CER in terms of cost. There's very small increase. And the impact happening on the cumulative emission, as you can see here. And in the slide after, we will see why there is no difference in the cost between the two scenarios. So the more you increase the demand, the more the impact of the clean electricity regulation on the emission increases. So here is the capacity results for all the 6 scenarios, as you can see here. And what we can see in all scenarios, that there is a substational build-out of natural gas in the green, as you can see here in the gray color. The difference between the business as usual and CER, as you can see here, that there will be a marginal increase in the natural gas with CCS, which is highlighted in the red circle here. We see that still there is a substational build-out of natural gas, and this is to keep the reserve margin. Atlantic Canada is a very resourceful place for wind, and that's why we see that there is a large installation of wind turbines, and we have seen that this result is very comparable to the result that we get from the IRP from Nova Scotia. Here is the electricity generation under all 6 different scenarios. We can see that they are almost the same within like the same demand growth scenario. We see that in the business as usual, we have a more burning of natural gas without CCS. That's why we have a higher emission in the business as usual. And that's highlighted in the red circle here. Although natural gas have been built out so much in the previous slide, as you can see, but it's not working. It's just there in the system to maintain the reserve margin. And this is how the capacity change over the planning horizon. As you can see here, that 2030 and 2040 is the leading years to have a higher capacity build out, and this is because of the coal phase out in 2030, and in 2040 because there's so many retired units in New Brunswick, and one of them is the nuclear power plant. So what are the main takeaway from this analysis? What we can say is that there is a marginal increase in the natural gas with CCS in the CR analysis, and the difference is not significant. And the reason why the difference between the two is not significant is because the wind build out in the CR and business as usual is driven by economics. And in the Atlantic region, we have a very large resources of hydro, which is existing. So decarbonization of the grid is happening independently of the CR policy. So as you have seen that in the mid growth and the high growth, that there is a substantial build out of capacity, and we modeled hydrogen in both, but the way we modeled hydrogen is different. In the mid growth, we model hydrogen as something that will be supplied through dedicated offshore and onshore wind, but in the high growth, we model it as something that is firm, that you have to supply that hydrogen at every single time. And that changed substantially the way that the capacity is built out. So things that need to be further investigated that we get from this analysis, that how much renewable energy need to be, like the control for the renewable energy project uptake and construction time. ACES model have the ability to control the pace at which the renewable energy can be built out. Capacity credit for the backup generators, and we will have another slides. We say that this is, we run a sensitivity analysis to see the impact of that. And hydrogen demand, how you model hydrogen. Hydrogen is a firm demand or is a non-firm demand. It's changed the equation so much. And here is the preliminary result for the changing the capacity credit for the backup generators, the generators that allow to work only 450 hours. And we can see here that once you're decreasing their capacity credits below 50%, the energy infrastructure changed so much, as you can see here in the first graph. And when it goes to 40%, there will be a build out of hydrogen combustion turbine and so much batteries. But if you see their activities, their generation is almost the same. There is no significant change in the all scenarios, even when there is like even under business as usual with a capacity credit of 40. Yeah, that's all. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I would be happy to answer any question after the session. Even you can email me after that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohammed. So as mentioned, we'll see the Mentimeter questions, but I have a couple questions that I wanted to ask, and then we can open it up for the audience. So I guess one of the things that I thought was interesting when you're modeling out the demand for the different scenarios, so low, medium, high, is the high you have this net increase because of hydrogen production. And you've pointed out that you're looking mainly at hydrogen domestic use. So what are the applications that are actually using that hydrogen, and in your analysis, like for what end uses?
There are so many discussions nowadays about using hydrogen as a fuel for heavy vehicles. They are saying that for heavy vehicles, it's quite impossible to implement batteries for them to plug them to the electricity. So they are thinking that the new market for that for the transportation would be using hydrogen to support these heavy-duty vehicles. And on top of that, for the heating also, I think there are many studies nowadays stating that you can add hydrogen to natural gas with a certain percentage that will reduce actually the emission that comes from burning natural gas for heating purposes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, like our organization really focuses on, blue hydrogen production, and the idea if you're trying to leverage natural gas to produce sort of a net zero fuel. But I guess one of the arguments that we hear a lot about using electrolysis for those end uses is that the relative efficiency becomes really challenging, right? Like, because you have to use electricity to produce hydrogen, where there are cases where electrification can work, but you're saying basically those are the tough to electrify end uses that you're modeling, mainly heavy duty.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So one question that I had as well is like, why do you have natural gas with carbon capture in your business as usual scenario? Why would that be an investment in a business as usual scenario?
This is driven by the carbon tax mainly. So it says that because you're gonna build natural gas,
yeah,
but that one would be to contribute to the reserve margin, but there will be an operation, right, to keep like as a peaker power plant.
Yeah.
So because of the carbon tax, the model chose to build out. Find it economically visible to build a natural gas with CCS.
Yes. So the carbon tax in your model basically is acting as a motivator for, like, it is acting as a signal to the market on its own.
Exactly.
In the absence of regulations.
Correct. Yes. And this is why we say there's so many decarbonized generators that have been placed in the model, as you can say. Okay. So the result, yeah.
That's good. And just my final question before I kind of take a couple of questions. To what extent did you model interregional connections, like Newfoundland to Nova Scotia, or like basically interconnections between the provinces? So
we have modeled the interconnection within the regions using the IRP reports and all the available data we have. So as I remember that we have the 300 megawatt transmission lines between PI and New Brunswick, and there's like a 475 megawatt transmission lines between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and there is the maritime links between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So we have put so much effort in modeling that, and we engaged so many organizations and utilities from the all Atlantic regions to come up with these numbers and to put them in the model. But of course, we always how the tariff and how the cost of transmissions and each province, how much they are asking money from the other province when they send their electricity. This is something that we need to have more clarification on, and I think having this kind of events help us to understand more how the transmission and distribution system works better.
That's great. Final question here, just so got a minute left. I'll take one from the Mentimeter. I mean, one interesting question is talking about the Premier of Nova Scotia said that they're open to nuclear energy, and basically thinking through, the role of nuclear in the region, specifically with New Brunswick, talking about SMRs. Have you? I mean, obviously your model is a cost optimization model, So it would kind of rule that out from a cost perspective. That's why we don't see it.
Exactly. So from the cost perspective, that's have been rolled out. But of course, these are a non-biased model, which means that it depends on the data that you give them. So if you have, for example, subsidies for the nuclear power plant and you want to put that in the model, it might come into play. And we have run some analysis for Atlantica before, where we have decided to put a very large subsidies on the SMRs, and we found out that the model pick up SMRs in the New Brunswick.
Okay, so you have found SMRs in New Brunswick coming up in your
But not in this analysis. Some analysis
yeah,
that we
for
did.
Atlantica Energy in
Exactly, yeah.
in New Brunswick. Okay, perfect. Well, we're at time. This was really great, Mohammed, and as mentioned, feel free to catch Mohammed anytime afterwards, and also the slides will be kind of shared if you want to dig in more detail. So yeah, thank you, and we'll move to our next speaker. So next up we have Douglas Bryan from Navius Research.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Douglas Bryan, and I'm representing Navius Research and our modeling of the clean electricity regulations, or the draft clean electricity regulations, I should say. So for those that don't know us, we're a Vancouver-based consulting firm, energy economy models we develop and use to analyze the impacts of climate and energy policies in Canada. Our analytical frameworks used by clients across the country. We have model lease agreements with various provincial governments. We work with utilities, industry associations, and energy companies, nonprofits, and really anyone with a keen interest in energy, climate change, and economics. Our modeling framework, so our most well-known model is GTEC. It's kind of our flagship model. It's a dynamic recursive CGE model. It's technologically explicit and includes over 300 technologies and provides a comprehensive representation of all economic activity, energy supply and demand, and greenhouse gas emissions. Our kind of partner model is the integrated electricity supply and demand model. So this is a capacity addition and hourly dispatch model that simulates Canada's electricity system across all 8,760 hours in a year. It's a zonal model, so we have each province represented, as well as the United States. And up until recently, we've used these models separately or had a kind of soft link between the two. But a recent upgrade to our modeling framework, which is part of what Sam and I have been presenting in the other room, is to upgrade the framework so that these two models now iterate. So how does that work? So GTEC kind of starts us off, solves all the way out to the end of our time horizon. It then provides its outputs to ISD related to electricity demand, fuel prices, policy impacts like carbon prices, and other important things for the electricity system. ISD then solves and iterates through the 8,760 hours in a year, and the outputs from that are then fed back into GTEC. So that includes things like electricity system costs, capacity and generation mix, emissions from the sector, and other electricity-related outputs. GTEC then takes that and runs again, and the whole process cycles until GTEC and ISD are talking the same language and we reach a point of conversion. So for the CER analysis, we use this model. So our approach to modeling the CER was to use two. Oh, sorry, I'm seeing I'm one step behind. Not sure why it's not coming up. Okay, there we go. Okay, our approach to modeling the CER. So we modeled two kind of core policy scenarios. One is our legislative policy scenario, so that includes all existing federal and provincial climate and energy policies, including the fuel charge and the OBPS, assuming that it rises to $170 a ton by 2030. One key important thing to mention here is that we assume that the OBPS continues to be binding after 2050, such that the market for credits achieves the $170 a ton out to 2050. That will be important later on. And then our draft CER scenario takes our legislative policy and then layers on top the draft CER. So key components of that include the 30 tons per gigawatt hour performance standard for all electricity generation, with some limited exceptions for CCS and cogeneration. The 20-year end-of-life provision, so as Mo put earlier, a plant commissioned in 2024 needn't comply until 2044. And then also the 450 hour per year restriction on non-compliant generators. So we also included sensitivity analysis. So this model is running a single scenario at a time. So to ensure that we're doing a robust analysis, we want to vary some key parameters. One of those sets of sensitivities were the CER parameters. So each of the bullets you see under the draft CER, we varied. So an example of that is we extended the end-of-life provision by 5 years. And another one is that we increased the hour restriction to 1,000 hours per year for non-compliant generators. We also varied the assumption of the CCS capture rate. So as part of these models, you have to make assumptions around the efficacy of technologies. CCS is an incredibly important component here when it comes to the CER, given that under certain circumstances, such as a 95% capture rate, the CER would be, the CCS technologies would be compliant. However, if CCS was unable to reach those levels, then it wouldn't necessarily be compliant, and that would have a big impact on compliance costs. And finally, we varied the restriction of cogeneration exports to the grid. So in all our scenarios, we apply the CER to cogeneration that is a net exporter to the grid, but we also applied an additional restriction as a sensitivity on making the assumption that cogen chooses to go behind the fence. So now I'll walk you through some of the key insights we gleaned from our analysis thus far. And the kind of spot estimates that I'm presenting here are from our reference case scenario where CCS is assumed to be compliant with the CER. So starting with emissions. So our kind of first insight is that the CER leads to additional emissions reductions beyond legislative policy, but it does not result in a net zero electricity grid. So the chart you're seeing there shows Canada-wide electricity emissions. Much of the incremental reductions you see kind of begin after 2035. So as Mo put as well, it's not net zero by 2035, nor is it near net zero by 2035. Because of the 20-year end-of-life provision, it really starts kicking in 2040 and in 2045. The emissions reductions then kind of level out after 2045, and that's going to be a function of growth in electricity demand. The incremental reductions beyond legislative policy largely come from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And the residual emissions are from things like behind-the-fence cogeneration, peaking plants, and non-captured emissions from CCS facilities. And while there is lower emissions, it does come at a cost for some provinces. So some provinces do experience higher electricity system costs under the CER. Provinces like Alberta, Ontario, and Saskatchewan kind of feel an incremental effect of the CER. Something to note here, so the chart you're seeing is the electricity prices in Alberta under the CER and legislative policy. I'm going to use Alberta as the provincial example from this point forward, given that it's expected to feel the CER quite acutely. Just looking at that chart there, so the legislative policies, we see increasing electricity prices under the legislative policies. Largely, that's a function of the carbon taxation both through the fuel charge and the OBPS, leading to higher electricity prices due to a changing generation mix. So kind of how Mohammed was saying earlier, they see some natural gas with CCS under legislative policy or their business as usual. We do as well, and that's a function of carbon pricing. There are cost savings from lower fuel and carbon costs, but from the reduced gas-fired generation, there is reliance on more renewables under the CER. But the increased capex from new capacity and the costs associated with a more variable grid do lead to higher system costs overall. So that $2 per megawatt hour difference, if you extend that across all end users in 2050, it's around a $300 million per year impact. Now, the CER policy design is important. And I mentioned that we varied some of the parameters of the CER, so I'm picking on those two again. One is extending the end-of-life provision by 5 years, so that would be a plant commissioned in 2024, needn't comply until 2049. And the second one is allowing non-compliant generators to operate up to 1,000 hours per year. So that's essentially a doubling of the allowed capacity factor, going from around 5% to just over 10%. So if we extend the end-of-life provision, we get a temporary lowering of electricity prices at the cost of additional emissions. So again, we've got the same chart there of the wholesale electricity prices under the CER in Alberta. This time we're comparing the CER draft with the extended end-of-life provision, and I've zoomed in there. You'll see in a minute why I have the y-axis as it is. Zoomed in there to see a savings of 65 cents a megawatt hour. Again, if we extend that across electricity demand in 2045, is about a $90 million saving across the system. And this comes at the cost of increased emissions. Largely it comes from combined cycle gas turbines that don't need to retire until later on, and it's about 1.5 megatons in 2045. Increasing the plant hour limit allows for less capacity to service a similar level of demand, which helps reduce electricity prices. This is a fairly intuitive result. If you're increasing the capacity factor of an existing plant, you require less capacity in order to meet that demand. So the chart you're seeing there is the incremental impact of increasing the CER hour limit on generation capacity in Alberta. The change there is negative, so by 2045 and 2050, we're looking at 750 megawatts less capacity. And for scale, that's about 2/3 of the existing combined cycle gas turbine fleet in Alberta. There are some additional emissions as a result of this, but the net impact is fairly marginal. So far, I've assumed that CCS facilities are able to achieve the CER requirements. And in Alberta, we see upwards of 10 gigawatts of CCS capacity for electricity generation as a result. However, if CCS facilities are unavailable, so if they don't meet that emissions intensity standard that they're required to, there's a big shift in the capacity mix. So the chart there you're seeing is the incremental impact of CCS being non-compliant under the CER, and you can see in 2045 and 2050, you get upwards of 30 plus gigawatts of additional capacity, which comparing that to the dotted line is more than double the total installed capacity fleet today. There is a big increase in renewables, and that is also coupled with kind of a tripling of storage capacity that isn't presented on that chart. Now you see why the y-axis was as it was. So this leads to a significant jump in electricity prices. So we're no longer looking at a $2 per megawatt hour impact. It's now closer to $30 a megawatt hour, so 15 times increase there. The emissions are also slightly higher when the CCS is not available. So that's basically a build out of things like single cycle gas turbines to provide that peaking capacity. Even if they're restricted at 450 hours a year, the kind of hourly prices hit points at which those sorts of turbines are still viable. So this reiterates the point that CER policy design is important, not just from the features in terms of the end-of-life provision, but also things like whether CCS is compliant or not. And my fourth and final insight is a bit of a teaser, but just talking about how policy interactions can lead to unexpected outcomes. So while the policy design is important, the policy interactions are just as important. So we assume, as I mentioned earlier, that in our scenarios, the OBPS continues to be binding. So the chart there you're seeing is the tier credit price. So we're assuming that the $170 per ton price remains binding. What if we were to remove that requirement? Well, under legislative policy without investment tax credit, so those are things like the renewables tax credit and the CCUS tax credit, the OBPS, or the tier I should say, remains binding out to 2035 and then slips slightly after 2040. That's kind of an expected outcome given that the way negotiations are going between the provinces and the feds now. 2035 is kind of the timeline they're assessing. If we're to include the investment tax credits there, we see a slipping of the carbon price. And what does that mean? It basically means that there's an oversupply of credits in the OBPS market, leading to a kind of significant drop-off in the credit price. What does that mean? It means lower incentives for decarbonization, not just in the electricity sector, but also across the economy. If we layer on the CER on top of that, it's an even steeper drop-off. And given that the oil and gas emissions cap, details of that were announced today, these are the sorts of questions that we need to be asking. What happens when you start layering on these policies altogether? You could get some adverse impacts as a result. When we ran the CER, using these scenarios, we ended up with much higher impacts of the CER, which is potentially counterintuitive if you're thinking about the tier credit price, but the reason is because the CER is essentially a command and control regulation once you hit 2045. So if carbon pricing hasn't been kind of slowly ratcheting up that transition, it becomes quite a big drop-off in 2045, leading to significant additional costs. So just in summary, the CER leads to additional emission reductions beyond legislative policy, but doesn't achieve net zero. Some provinces experience higher electricity system costs under the CER. The CER policy design matters, so as we're kind of going through the consultation stage, the end-of-life provision, CCS compliance, all things to take into account. And the fourth is that policy interactions could lead to unexpected outcomes, so it's important to consider the policy suite as a whole. And there's just a little plug for the Canada Energy Dashboard. If you're interested in that, Sam and I will be in the other room during the breaks. Thank you.
Thanks, Douglas. If folks want to ask questions, you can come up to the mic, and also we have Mentimeter. So we have a few minutes here for a discussion. I'll try to make mine quick so that we can take more audience questions. So I'm curious to what extent you modeled battery storage, specifically when you talk about the non-compliant carbon capture. I mean, I've heard an argument in terms of like, if we're modeling 95% carbon capture, why aren't we modeling more ambitious battery technology that still hasn't materialized, like the carbon capture technology?
I think it's a very good point. So the scenarios that you saw there include kind of utility scale lithium battery storage, but we do have scenarios where we're including hydrogen storage as an option, and it does make an important difference because when you're kind of expanding the technologies available, and especially storage technologies which have the ability of shifting load and lowering the kind of peak load, which is essentially what the system is designed to handle, it does make a big difference.
Great. I'll make mine quick here too. So the end of life extension, you mentioned 1.5 megatons. Is that cumulative, annual? Right?
That's an annual value. So I guess if you were thinking, because our model solves in 5-year increments, so you could interpolate that between 2035 or 2040, I should say, and 2045, and then down to 2050. So it's not insignificant in cumulative terms. Okay.
And then the increasing hour limit to what I wasn't actually clear. What did you increase it to? So from 450 to what?
To 1,000 hours.
Okay,
so we essentially doubled the allowed capacity factor, which makes the economics of continuing to run peaking plants kind of more viable. Yeah.
And what were the emission impacts of that?
I think it was around like half a megaton, like an increase in about half a megaton. And yeah, I think the ability for that to service demand with less capacity helped reduce costs as well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Take an audience question, Nomal.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. I mean, I'm a bit puzzled because $2 a megawatt hour is essentially zero. So there's essentially no cost to CER from what I can see. And there's no gain in increasing, for example, to 1,000 hour in your model or to, I mean, these fetch, because this is so small with respect to the overall cost that essentially there's no effect of CER on the cost of electricity. I mean, that would have been my reading, not that there's a cost really to CER. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think in the scenario I presented there, the impact of the OBPS and the tier program in Alberta especially is quite important. So things like the credit that renewables receive from the OBPS, the kind of the heat credit that cogeneration plants receive from the tier program, as well as things that we include in our legislative policy like the CCUS ITCs. A lot of that impact is actually felt in our legislative policy scenario. So the kind of incremental impact of achieving the CER beyond that is, yeah, you're right, it's on the margin. What is interesting, and I kind of teased it at the end, is that if you assume that the OBPS kind of keeps the same performance standards as we have now, then there's a much bigger impact. And I kind of try to showcase that with the CCUS non-compliance, and like just showing that there is kind of quite a big range of potential outcomes in Alberta.
Which is like your $30 increase to
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the idea as well is like where you're showing essentially if the carbon tax is axed, then that would have like you're not modeling that right now. You're assuming that binding 170 per ton.
Yeah, it's our interpretation of what legislative policy means, and obviously, we're at a time where carbon pricing is very much up for debate, and in a scenario where that doesn't occur, when the CER does become binding, we do see a kind of a steeper impact, and yeah, happy to share those results in more detail.
That's great. I think one of the things I'm curious about, specifically that's relevant for Alberta, is cogen. Were you able to do anything on that?
Yeah, so the 10-minute slot, I couldn't start to get into cogen because it deserves its own presentation, I think. But so what's interesting with using the CG models and modeling cogen, we did apply the kind of constraint on net exports to the grid unless you're compliant with the CER. What our model kind of liked to do was then to perfectly apportion the self-consumption of electricity from industry via cogeneration to unabated natural gas, kind of the existing natural gas fleet for cogeneration, and then the remainder it would deploy CCS or SMRs and export to the grid. In reality, you're likely to have you don't have the choice of a continuous number of cogen facilities. They're more discrete, and so you have one option: you either deploy CCS or not, which is part of why we had that. We included a sensitivity on cogeneration and whether they go behind the fence or not. If they do go behind the fence, we have a situation where, depending on the OBPS and whether it's binding or not, we either see industry increasing its own electricity consumption in order to benefit from the OBPS credits it receives from heat generation, or cogeneration goes off a cliff because it's no longer able to benefit from the electricity market revenues that it receives.
Okay, thanks. Well, I do want to take one question from Menti just to make sure that we're covering that. One thing is, why did you only model less stringency as opposed to more stringency, more emission reductions?
That's a very good question, and I think it's in large part because of just we kind of studied the debate around the CER, and potentially they're kind of leveraging a strong position and then conceding. You'd have to talk to Pascal and others about that. But yeah, I think that was kind of our assumption. But I totally agree. It's a valuable exercise to see what would happen if it went a step further.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.